At the will reading, my billionaire grandfather left me $27 billion. The room didn't explode with cheers. It went silent. I felt every eye turn toward me as the lawyer's words settled into the air like a verdict. My hands were shaking not because of the money, but because I suddenly saw two people standing near the back of the room, faces I hadn't seen since I was a child. My parents. They had been gone for 29 years. No calls, no letters, no birthdays, just absence. And now they were here. My mother's eyes filled with tears the moment she saw me. My father's jaw tightened, calculating, impatient. I knew that look. It wasn't love. It wasn't regret. It was hunger. That was the moment I understood something terrifying. The inheritance wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a war I never asked for. When they finally approached me and said, "We need to talk," I took a deep breath and answered with one word. No. I didn't know yet how much that word would cost me. I was 7 years old the last time I saw my parents walk out of my life. Not in a dramatic way, no slam doors, no shouting, just two suitcases by the door. My mother fixing her lipstick in the hallway mirror. My father checking his watch like he was late for a meeting that mattered more than his daughter. "Be good, Violet," my mother said, already turning away. That was it. No explanation, no promise to come back. No hug. I remember standing there barefoot on the cold tile floor holding a stuffed rabbit with one ear torn off. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just watched the door close and waited for it to open again. It never did. They told people later that they were going through a difficult time, that it was temporary, that they needed space. But days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into years. Birthdays passed. School plays ended with empty seats. Report cards were signed by someone else. My grandfather Henry became the one who picked me up from school. He was already wealthy. Then everyone in town knew his name. But inside the house none of that mattered. What mattered was that dinner was always on the table at 6. That my homework was checked. That someone listened when I talked about my day. Still, there were nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what I had done wrong. Children always assume it's their fault. When I was 9, I asked my grandfather the question I had been holding inside for years. Did I make them leave? He put down his newspaper slowly and looked at me for a long time. Not with pity, not with anger, with something heavier. No, he said quietly. Some people run when responsibility scares them. That has nothing to do with you. I wanted to believe him, but believing didn't stop the ache. At school, teachers asked why my parents never came to meetings. Friends asked why I lived with my grandfather. I learned early how to smile and say, "They're busy," like it didn't hurt. I learned how to stop asking questions that wouldn't be answered. My parents never called, never sent money, never asked if I was okay. It was as if I had slipped out of their lives without leaving a mark. And the longer they stayed gone, the more invisible they became until they were just shadows in old photographs. Faces I barely recognized. My grandfather never spoke badly about them. That somehow hurt more. He didn't try to replace them either. He didn't pretend he was my father. He simply showed up every day, quietly, consistently. When I was older, I realized how rare that was. But back then, I was just a little girl learning how to be strong too early. So when people look at me now and say I was lucky to grow up with a billionaire grandfather, I want to laugh because money didn't tuck me in at night. Money didn't sit in the audience when I played the lead in the school play. Money didn't teach me what it felt like to be chosen. What raised me wasn't wealth, it was presence. And what haunted me wasn't poverty, it was abandonment. My grandfather never tried to fill the space my parents left. He didn't buy my love with gifts or distract me with luxuries. In fact, for someone the world called a billionaire, he lived with surprising simplicity. The house was large, yes, but quiet. No gold fixtures, no flashy cars lined up in the driveway. Just solid furniture, old books, and a grandfather clock that ticked steadily in the hallway, like a reminder that time always moves forward, whether you're ready or not. Every morning he woke up before sunrise. I would hear the soft clink of his coffee cup, the rustle of newspapers, the scratch of a pen on paper. When I came downstairs, he'd look up over his glasses and smile. "Morning, Violet," he'd say. "Sit, eat." That was his way of loving, practical, steady, unquestionable. When I was 10, I finally asked him the question everyone else avoided. "Grandpa, are we rich?" He didn't laugh. He didn't dodge it. He folded the newspaper, set it aside, and looked at me carefully. "Wealth," he said, "is not a number. It's a responsibility." I didn't understand what that meant back then. All I knew was that other kids had parents who showed up. I had a grandfather who did. As I grew older, I began to notice things. How he paid every employee on time, sometimes early. How he remembered the names of people others ignored. How he never raised his voice but somehow commanded respect. Anyway, when people spoke to him, they listened. One evening when I was 12, I found him in his study staring at documents spread across the desk, numbers, charts, signatures. I asked if he was working. No, he said. I'm planning. Planning what? He motioned for me to sit beside him. I'm planning for a day when I won't be here, he said calmly. The words terrified me. I don't want to hear about that, I whispered. He smiled gently. That's exactly why you need to. He told me something that night I would never forget. Money doesn't protect weak people, Violet. It reveals strong ones. When it comes, it doesn't change who you are. It shows who you've always been. I nodded, pretending to understand. What I didn't realize then was that he wasn't just talking about money. He was talking about my parents, about absence, about choice. He never spoke their names with bitterness, but he never defended them either. Silence again, but this time it felt intentional, like a boundary. When I was a teenager, I once asked him if he ever expected my parents to come back. He paused before answering. People don't return when they feel ashamed, he said. They return when they want something. That sentence stayed with me. At the time, I thought he was being cynical. Years later, standing in that reading room, watching my parents step forward with trembling hands and hungry eyes, I finally understood my grandfather hadn't just raised me. He had been preparing me for this. The will reading took place on a gray Tuesday morning in a quiet law office that smelled faintly of leather chairs and old paper. I remember thinking how ordinary the room felt for something that was about to reshape my entire life. There were relatives I barely recognized, distant cousins, half-remembered faces from childhood holidays. They whispered to one another, stealing glances at me, at the door, at the man seated at the head of the table. Mr. Jonathan Reed, my grandfather's lawyer, cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. We are here today, he said, to read the last will and testament of Mr. Henry Carter. My chest tightened at the sound of my grandfather's name spoken in the past tense. I folded my hands in my lap, trying to stay calm. I wasn't expecting anything extraordinary. A house, some investments, maybe a trust to manage carefully. My grandfather had always been private, deliberate. I assumed he divided things neatly, fairly, logically. Then Mr. Reed reached the final pages. He paused, and that pause was heavy. To my granddaughter he read slowly. Violet Carter. I leave my entire controlling interest in Carter Holdings, all private assets and all associated trusts. The room went still. Mr. Reed looked up. The estimated value at the time of this reading is approximately $27 billion. I swear I stopped breathing. $27 billion. The words didn't make sense at first. They felt unreal, like numbers you hear in the news but never connect to yourself. A soft gasp rippled through the room. Someone dropped a pen. Another person whispered, "That can't be right." I didn't move. I couldn't. That was when I felt it. An unmistakable shift in the air. A presence behind me. I turned and there they were, my parents standing just inside the doorway as if they'd been there all along. My mother's eyes widened when she saw me. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Violet," she whispered, like my name had been a prayer she'd just remembered. My father's gaze didn't soften. It sharpened. I hadn't seen them in 29 years. Yet, in that moment I recognized them instantly. Time had aged their faces but not their intentions. Mr. Reed cleared his throat again. "Please," he said carefully. "If you are not named parties, you'll need to." "We're her parents," my father interrupted, stepping forward. "We have every right to be here." My heart started pounding. Not from fear, from instinct. Somewhere deep inside, a voice my grandfather had planted long ago whispered a warning. This wasn't a reunion. This was a claim. And before the ink on the will had even dried in my mind, I knew one thing with terrifying clarity. The money had finally brought them back. And they weren't going to leave quietly. The moment the will reading ended, they moved. Not toward me with open arms, not with questions about my life or how I'd survived without them. They moved with purpose, tight smiles, measured steps, the kind people use when they're about to negotiate something valuable. "Violet," my mother said softly, reaching for my hand as if the last 29 years were nothing more than a misunderstanding. "We should talk privately." I pulled my hand back before she could touch me. My father didn't bother with softness. "This isn't appropriate," he said, glancing at the other relatives. Family matters shouldn't be handled like this. Family? The word landed wrong. Mr. Reed stood. If you'd like to schedule a separate meeting. No need. My father cut in. This concerns us directly. I felt the weight of every eye in the room press into my back. The whispers started immediately. Some people looked confused. Others looked entertained. A few looked relieved it wasn't them at the center of the storm. My mother took a shaky breath as if she were the injured party here. Violet, sweetheart, you have to understand we never meant to stay away that long. Things just happened. I let out a short, humorless laugh before I could stop myself. Things happened for 29 years. Her eyes filled with tears on cue. We were young. We were overwhelmed. You can't punish us forever for that. Punish. As if my life had been a sentence they were serving. My father stepped closer, lowering his voice. Let's be reasonable. Your grandfather was my father. Whatever he left you, fine, but all of it. That doesn't make sense. It made sense to him. I said. He shook his head. You're being emotional. You're not thinking clearly. There was. The familiar tone, firm, dismissive, corrective. The tone of someone who believes authority is something they're owed. You're too young to manage this kind of wealth alone, he continued. We're willing to help. We deserve a share. My mother nodded quickly. We're family, Violet. Blood matters. I felt something inside me tighten. Not fear, not sadness, but clarity. Blood didn't matter when I was 7, I said quietly. The room fell silent again. My father exhaled sharply. That's not fair. No, I replied. What's not fair is showing up after almost 3 decades and asking me to hand over my grandfather's life's work like it's overdue rent. My mother's tears stopped instantly. Don't speak to us like that, she said, her voice suddenly cold. We gave you life and then you walked away from it, I answered. She stood up straighter, offended now. We didn't abandon you. We made a choice. Yes, I said. You did. My father leaned in, his eyes hard. Listen carefully. If you think you can shut us out, you're mistaken. We have legal options. The word legal echoed in my chest. Mr. Reed cleared his throat again, trying to intervene. Mr. Carter, the estate. This isn't over. My father snapped. Not by a long shot. I looked at him fully then. Really looked. Not the man I'd once imagined might come back for me. Not the father I'd secretly hoped existed somewhere. Just a stranger who saw me as an obstacle between himself and something he wanted. I'm not giving you anything, I said. My voice didn't shake. My mother gasped. How can you be so cruel? Cruel. Another word twisted into a weapon. I learned it from you, I said calmly. You taught me how to disappear. For a moment no one spoke. Then my father smiled a thin, dangerous smile. Fine, he said. If you won't do this as family, we'll do it properly. Properly? How? I asked, already knowing the answer. Through lawyers, he said. Courts, public records, media if necessary. My stomach dropped, but I didn't show it. Mr. Reed stepped forward at last, his voice firm. The will is valid. The trust is airtight. Threats will not change that. My father turned on him. Everyone has a weakness. I felt something rise in my chest, then not panic but anger. Clean, sharp anger. You don't get to scare me, I said. You don't get to rewrite my life because money finally made me visible to you. My mother stared at me like she didn't recognize me. Maybe she didn't because the girl who waited by the door was gone. My father gathered his coat, eyes never leaving mine. This isn't finished, he said quietly. You'll hear from us, I nodded once. I'm sure I will. They walked out together side by side just as they had all those years ago. Only this time I didn't watch the door hoping it would open again. I watched it close and I knew with absolute certainty that saying no had only been the first step. The real fight was just beginning. The first letter arrived 3 days later. Cream-colored paper, expensive envelope. My father's name typed neatly at the top as if formality could disguise intent. I didn't open it right away. I already knew what it would say. I could hear his voice in my head, calm, certain, instructing the world to bend. When I finally did, my hands were steady, a formal notice of intent. They were contesting the will. The language was polished and cold. It spoke of rights, familial obligation, undue influence. It suggested without saying it outright that my grandfather had been manipulated, that I had benefited unfairly, that I was unqualified, emotionally compromised, and therefore unfit. I felt the room tilt not because I believed them, because they were trying to erase the man who raised me by turning him into a legal argument. That night my phone rang until I turned it off. Unknown numbers, voicemails I didn't listen to, messages from relatives who hadn't spoken to me in years. Suddenly remembered my name. Maybe you should just settle. Family is family. This could get ugly. Ugly. I sat alone at my kitchen table. The letter spread open in front of me. And for the first time since the will reading, fear slipped through the cracks. Not fear of losing money, but fear of losing my grandfather all over again. This time in public, piece by piece, through accusations and headlines. The next morning, I went straight to Jonathan Reed's office. He read the letter once, then again. Then he sat it down and looked at me with something close to anger. "They're bluffing," he said. I exhaled. "You're sure?" "As sure as the law allows," he replied. "Your grandfather anticipated this. That's why the trust is structured the way it is. Independent evaluations, medical records, years of documentation. He wasn't just careful, he was deliberate." I swallowed. "They're saying he was influenced," he raised a hand gently. "They can say whatever they want. Saying it doesn't make it true." I leaned back in the chair, my heart pounding. "So they can't take it?" "No," he said firmly. "They can try and they will, but they can't win." Relief washed over me, thin, fragile, but real. Then he added, "That doesn't mean it won't hurt." He was right. Within weeks, the pressure escalated. My mother sent emails late at night, long and rambling, swinging between apology and accusation. "I carried you for 9 months. Your grandfather turned you against us. Do you know what people are saying about me?" My father was quieter but more dangerous. His lawyer requested meetings, proposed settlements, suggested that dragging this out would damage my reputation. He hinted at media interest, at leaked documents, at narratives I wouldn't like. Every word was a test. Would I crack? Would I panic? Would I trade my grandfather's wishes for peace? Some nights I almost did. I'd wake up with my chest tight, imagining courtrooms and strangers dissecting my childhood. I'd picture my grandfather's name dragged through doubt, his intentions questioned by people who never knew him. On one of those nights I found myself standing in his study, the room he used to sit in, surrounded by books and quiet. I ran my fingers along the desk where he'd planned everything. "You knew," I whispered into the silence. "You knew they'd do this." And in that quiet, something settled inside me. This wasn't just about money. This was about boundaries. About choosing not to reward abandonment. About understanding that protecting myself wasn't cruelty. It was survival. The next morning I told Jonathan to proceed. "No settlements," I said. "No compromises. If they want to fight, they'll have it in the open. Under the law." He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "That's exactly what your grandfather expected you to say." The first hearing was scheduled shortly after. As I walked into the courthouse days later, cameras flashing, my parents waiting across the room with practiced expressions of concern, I felt something surprising, not fear, resolve. They had come back for everything. But they were about to learn that I wasn't the child they left behind. And I wasn't backing down. The courtroom wasn't where the truth finally came out. It was a quiet afternoon, 2 weeks after the first hearing, when Jonathan called me into his office and closed the door behind me. "They made a mistake," he said. I looked up. What kind of mistake? The kind people make when they assume money erases history. He slid a folder across the desk. Inside were documents I'd never seen before. Emails, bank records, dated correspondence. My grandfather's handwriting appeared on several pages, steady and unmistakable. Jonathan tapped one page. "Your parents didn't just disappear. They signed agreements, voluntary ones." My chest tightened. "Agreements?" "Your grandfather offered support back then. Housing, financial help, even mediation. They refused in writing. They wanted no involvement, no responsibility, no conditions." I stared at the page, my hands trembling now despite my efforts to stay calm. "So they chose to leave," I whispered. "Yes," Jonathan said gently. "And they chose to stay gone. Away." The documents showed more than absence. They showed intention, clear dates, clear decisions, no confusion, no coercion. My grandfather had kept everything, not out of spite, out of protection. "There's more," Jonathan added. He turned another page. A timeline, notes from estate planners, a clause highlighted in yellow, condition of inheritance disclosure. My grandfather had written that if my parents ever attempted to claim the estate, these records were to be submitted immediately to establish context and intent. He had planned for this moment. I felt a strange mix of grief and gratitude press against my ribs. He had known they might return not because they loved me but because they wanted what he'd built. That night my mother called. I almost didn't answer. "Violet," she said, skipping any greeting, her voice brittle. "Why are you doing this?" "Doing what?" I asked quietly, dragging the past into court, making us look heartless. I closed my eyes. "I'm not dragging anything out. You brought it back." She scoffed. "We didn't know he'd become this powerful, this rich. There was. Not we missed you. Not we regret leaving. Just money. So that's it?" I asked. "If he hadn't been wealthy you'd still be gone." Silence. Then she said, "You don't understand how hard our lives were." I almost laughed. "I was 7," I replied. "And you left me anyway." Her voice sharpened. "You're turning into him." Cold, calculated. "No," I said calmly. "I'm turning into myself." The call ended abruptly. 2 days later the filings were submitted. The records, the letters, the signed refusals. The narrative shifted overnight. Headlines softened. Whispers changed direction. People who had urged me to settle suddenly went quiet. Some even apologized. My father avoided eye contact at the next hearing. His confidence cracked just slightly. For the first time since they returned I saw it. They weren't powerful anymore. They were exposed. And in that moment, standing on the courthouse steps, the wind sharp against my face, I realized something that stunned me. The hardest part of this fight wasn't saying no. It was accepting the truth I'd avoided my entire life. They hadn't left because they had to. They left because they wanted to. And no amount of money, 27 billion or otherwise, could ever rewrite that choice. Part 7. The moment I chose myself. The final confrontation didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in a quiet conference room. Weeks later, when my parents asked for one last meeting, "No lawyers," my mother said over the phone. "Just us, please." Against my better judgment but guided by a need for closure, I agreed. They were already seated when I arrived. My father sat stiffly, hands folded, eyes tired. My mother looked smaller than I remembered, her confidence replaced by something fragile and defensive. "Thank you for coming," she said quickly, as if gratitude might soften what came next. I didn't sit down. "Say what you came to say," I replied. My father cleared his throat. "We've discussed this," he began. "Dragging this out won't benefit anyone. The court process, the attention, it's exhausting. We think it's best to put this behind us." I nodded slowly. "And by put this behind us, you mean?" My mother leaned forward. "A settlement, something reasonable. We walk away quietly. You keep your reputation. Everyone wins." I felt a strange calm settle over me. "For 29 years," I said evenly. "You walked away quietly. Now you want the same privilege on your terms. That's not fair." My father snapped, the old edge returning. "You're profiting from bitterness." "No," I corrected him. "I'm protecting myself from manipulation." My mother's eyes filled again, but this time the tears didn't move me. "Were your parents?" she whispered. "You'll regret this one day." I looked at them. Both really looked. Two people who had confused biology with entitlement. Who believed regret could be weaponized. "I already regret something," I said softly. "I regret waiting so long to set boundaries." I reached into my bag and placed a single document on the table. A formal cease and desist notice. My father's face drained of color. "This is your final warning," I continued. "Any further contact, any public statements, any attempts to pressure or intimidate me will be handled exclusively through my legal team." Silence swallowed the room. My mother stared at the paper as if it were written in a foreign language. "So that's it?" she asked. "You're cutting us off?" I took a breath. "I'm not cutting you off," I said. "I'm closing a door you never tried to keep open." I turned to leave. Behind me my father spoke one last time. "You think this makes you strong?" I paused at the doorway, my hand resting on the frame. "No," I said without turning around. "It proves I already was." I walked out of that room lighter than I'd felt in years. Not because I had won, but because for the first time in my life, I had chosen myself without guilt, without fear, and without asking permission. And that decision, more than any inheritance, was what finally made me free. After everything was over, the filings, the hearings, the final silence, I expected relief to feel louder, like a victory. Instead, it arrived quietly. One morning, I sat alone in my grandfather's old study, sunlight cutting through the window and resting on the same desk where he used to plan his days. The house was still, no phones ringing, no legal updates, no threats waiting in my inbox. Just me. For the first time I wasn't reacting. I wasn't defending. I wasn't bracing for the next blow. I was thinking. People assume that inheriting an enormous fortune answers every question in your life. That money closes wounds, that it replaces what was missing. It doesn't. Money doesn't hug you when you're afraid. It doesn't sit beside you when you're confused, and it certainly doesn't tell you who deserves access to your heart. What it does do is remove excuses. It removes the illusion that you need to tolerate harm to survive. It removes the pressure to stay quiet just to feel secure. And it forces you to confront a truth many people avoid their entire lives. Not everyone who shares your blood is safe for you. For years I believed strength meant endurance, staying silent, letting things pass, being the bigger person. I was wrong. Real strength is knowing when to stop explaining yourself to people who benefit from misunderstanding you. Real strength is recognizing manipulation even when it's dressed up as love. And real strength is understanding that boundaries are not punishments, they are protections. My grandfather understood that. He didn't leave me $27 billion to make me powerful. He left it to make me free. Free to say no. Free to walk away. Free to choose a life that wasn't built on fear or obligation. I used part of the inheritance to continue his work. Investing responsibly, supporting education, creating programs that gave others the kind of stability I once needed. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. And in doing so, I finally understood the lesson he'd been teaching me since I was a child. Money reveals who you are when pressure arrives. When my parents came back, money didn't make them kinder. It didn't make them honest. It simply gave them a reason to show up. And when I stood in front of them and said, no, money didn't give me courage. Clarity did. If you're listening to this and you've ever felt guilty for protecting yourself, especially from family, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not selfish for choosing peace. You are not cruel for enforcing boundaries, and you are not obligated to reopen doors that nearly destroyed you. Love that demands silence is not love. Family that returns only when you're valuable is not family. And forgiveness does not require access. I don't hate my parents, but I no longer confuse absence with misunderstanding. Some people don't lose you, they forfeit you. Today when I look at my life, I don't measure it in numbers or assets. I measure it in something far rarer, self-respect. And that more than any inheritance, more than any courtroom victory, is the legacy I will carry forward. Not because I was given everything, but because I finally learned what was never meant to be taken from me.